Hello, Ron. Today we talk about mortars, and for this I brought a guest who formerly served in the Irish Armed Forces. Hello, Dermot.
Hi, how are you doing?
Fine, and you?
Good, good. Glad to be here.
So, if you like accents, you really enjoy this talk. If not, you're probably on the wrong channel anyway. So, Dermot, get a basic understanding on what kind of mortar you served. So, basically, the caliber, what kind of range, what was the payload. So, the basic technical details. What can you tell us?
So, I served between 2001 and 2013, and in my time I served on two separate mortar systems, both 120 millimeters. One was a French mortar called the AM50, which entered service with the Irish Defence Forces in 1954, if I remember correctly. The same model of mortar is, if you have any French listeners, was used by the French Fourth Legion at the end of Fu, so it's kind of an old system. And that was withdrawn from service in 2003 and then replaced by a Swiss mortar called the RUAG M87 in 2008, I'm going to say. Could be 2009, I'm not exactly sure the year. Both 120 millimeter mortars. The brand had a range of 6.5 kilometers. That was maximum range. I'm not entirely sure of the planning range because it's been nearly 20 years, so I'll be watching on that. And the RUAG had a maximum range of 8.2 kilometers, but a planning range, which is your maximum range minus 10%, so planning range around 7.5 kilometers. The M87, the Swiss mortar, had a 14 kilo bomb, and that bomb contained about 3 kilos of high explosive, which is a little bit more than the shell in a 105 light gun, so the M1 shell that the US use. So it's substantial amount of firepower for a small system, and it's, I don't know if you've seen a 120 mortar, the barrels are generally around 6 feet long. It's slightly under 2 meters, 1.8 meters, so they're pretty small, pretty mobile, and for us, it was useful for us. They're quite flexible because you could hide them behind buildings, you can hide them behind terrain, and you could tow them in small vehicles. So, as in our case, we towed them in what were essentially civilian cars painted green. So, Nissan Patrols, Mitsubishi Pajeros, Isuzu Troopers, and the like. So, you didn't need a dedicated tower. You had something quite small, quite nimble to tow them. The mortar had a crew of 6. So, you had the detachment commander, you had a layer, who's the guy who operates the sites. He was the number 3, so the two most important people on the crew are number 1 and the number 3. The number 2 was the loader, the number 4 and 5 were ammunition numbers, and the number 6 was the driver. Now, 9 times out of 10, the driver would stay with the vehicle and wouldn't actually get involved with firing of the weapon, but in a sustained firing situation, the driver may help prepare ammunition, load ammunition, or do other ways, do ammunition administration around the gun position. In theory, in Ireland, a detachment commander, so the person in charge of a gun, so a 105 howitzer or a 120 light mortar, is a sergeant, but in practice it's frequently corporal. So, for example, I was a corporal, and in theory, the layer, the guy who sets the sights, is normally a corporal, but in practice it was a gunner. So, just a small caveat. So, anybody who knows artillery, private soldiers aren't referred to as privates, they're referred to as gunners. We have a joke: a private's something I pee through, right? So yeah, we in Ireland, because generally we were short-staffed, we would have a corporal in charge of a gun 9 times out of 10, or a mortar in this case, and a gunner doing the laying, so actually laying out the gun. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I find the organization interesting because it's similar basically to a German anti-tank gun in the Second World War. Basically, you have the driver and then you have the other people. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It's a gun system, so what else are you gonna do?
If you look at them, yeah, exactly. If you look at a military manual of the way you even sit in the car, it's the same. So the driver sits in the driver's seat, the number 1, the passenger seat, the number 2 on the inside, the number 3 on the outside, and everybody has a designated place. So the idea being that when you get into action, you can debus and be where you need to be, quick, fast, and in a hurry. So yeah, it's quite similar. And the other thing is that the way we organise brigades. So in Ireland, we don't have divisions, we don't have corps. We have currently 2 brigades. When I started, we had 3 brigades of regulars and 3 brigades of reserves, and I was obviously in the reserve. When I joined, it was a little bit of a mishmash. So the reserve essentially was very similar to the local defence force or territorial defence force in Ukraine, in that every village would have a company or a platoon, and then over time these were amalgamated into units. So you'd have one part of the country would have 4 infantry battalions and 1 artillery regiment, whereas another would have 2 artillery regiments and 1 infantry battalion. And whereas the regular army was broken into 3 brigades, and each brigade had 3 infantry battalions, an artillery regiment, an engineer company, and a cavalry squadron. So basically the things a brigade needs to do, whereas the reserve was kind of mishmash. Around 2005, it was decided that we would have the reserve mirror the regulars, so that you would have 3 brigades, and the brigade would also be a triangular structure, 3 infantry battalions, 1 artillery regiment, and the artillery regiment would have 3 gun batteries or 3 mortar batteries. So obviously each battery would be then able to support one of the infantry battalions of the brigade.
And how many mortars were in one battery?
According to the manual, 12. In practice, between 6 and 8. I don't think I've seen any fire units with more than 8. And I don't think, in terms of actual shooting, so when we would actually go and do our annual shoot, I don't think I was ever in a firing battery that was more than 6. So you could have a regiment of 18 mortars or 18 guns in the field at one time, but that would be 3 batteries. So the manual says one thing, but practice says another, right? Yeah, and just for clarity, in Irish parlance, a regiment is not a brigade, it's not a division, it's a battalion size. So it's more or less an honorific given to the artillery. So there's no infantry regiments, there's no cavalry regiments, there's no, engineer regiments, there's no medical regiments. There are artillery regiments, but in effect, they, per NATO scale, would essentially be an artillery battalion. So they are 3 company-sized fire units plus a headquarter unit. So the terminology is a little bit loose, but if you think about a regiment, you think of something with several battalions. In the Irish case, it's not true. It's 1 unit subdivided by essentially company-sized units.
So now in combat, more or less, you had a battery in... You had several batteries inside a battalion or in a brigade?
Well, we would call it a regiment. But yeah, in effect, a regiment in Irish parlance is an artillery battalion. And that battalion will be organic to a brigade. As I say, we don't have any higher formations. So within a brigade, you'll have an organic artillery So in a brigade, you have an organic artillery regiment. And that regiment has 3 fire units, so essentially 3 batteries of between 6 and 8 guns or mortars, depending on the particular unit. And each of those, in theory, is assigned to support one of the infantry battalions organic to that brigade.
Okay, so basically the fire mission would then go, or the command, the order would come from the battalion, from the forward observer or the commander to your battery commander.
Depends. So in theory, the way it should go. So again, as I was saying, when I joined the reserve, was a bit of a mishmash. So the way we would train for the first 3 years or so of my service is that we would go on our annual shoot, and our battery would put 6 mortars in the field, and we would shoot. And in theory, we would be supporting who knows what objective, right? And around 2006, it was realized that what actually needs to happen is that an artillery regiment needs to be integrated into the brigade properly, and that when an artillery regiment goes to shoot, it's in support of other units, because obviously in a combat situation, an artillery regiment's not just going around doing its own thing, it's in support of something. So it was decided then that we would do what we called brigade level shoots. So the support companies of the various battalions were invited to shoot alongside us. So they would bring their GPM-GSF, their anti-tank, their 81s and their 60mm mortars. The cavalry guys would bring, at the time I think they had AML-90s, which is a pretty cool little car. We should bring them back just because they look cool. And somebody else, I can't remember. But they would all then fire together, but they would be coordinated with what was called the Fire Support Coordination Centre, so FSCC, which was at brigade level. They would detail a fire plan to the brigade. That would then go to the subunits at our level. It would be Fire Direction Centre, which would be essentially, it would be regimental level, so essentially battalion level in normal speak. And then at battery level, you'd have command post officer. So he would then detail to the actual fire units on the ground what they would shoot at. But he would then be in support of the FDC and the FSCC, who would be in support of what the brigade commander wants. And that's essentially the theory, but 9 times out of 10, when we would practice, it would be a regiment will go to the field, put out its guns, and fire in support of imaginary targets, imaginary objectives. Whereas in reality, what we were supposed to do is be in support of other units, and eventually that became the way we would do things. And what was quite interesting as reservists is that we were the first reserve unit to do that, because we were told, or allegedly we were told, that it wasn't going to be possible, we wouldn't have the ability to do it, and we wouldn't be able to get people together. And as a proof of concept, we did it, and it worked out. It was tough work, but like it makes sense, because when you think about it, a cavalry squadron is not just doing its own thing, an infantry battalion is not doing its own thing. What's, if you're going to have maneuver, who's doing a maneuver? It's brigade. Okay, so brigade needs to work together, and so we got away from that old, let's say, local defense force mentality, where it was like the guys in the local village are doing their own thing. They're not. They're working together, and that's the theory. Go on.
Let's talk about more or less tactics. So first off, what different kinds of fire missions, I'm not sure if that is correct, this term is, did you have or were common?
Yeah, the fire mission is the correct term. So, for example, the order to actually get ready to shoot is fire mission, and then whatever the subdivision. So if you have all of the artillery corps there, it would be fire mission corps. If you have a regiment, fire mission regiment, a battery, and so on, down to troop or single gun, or single mortar in this case. The fire missions depend on the ammunition, and it's important to bring this up because with the French mortars, so the AM50 back in the early 2000s, we had HE, so high explosive, we had smoke, and we had Illum. So HE for destroying high explosive.
What was the last one?
Illumination.
Illumination, okay, yeah.
Yeah, paraflares. So you had 3 different missions you could do with those types of ammunition. With the Swiss mortar, we didn't have smoke for some reason. So when that system came in, that was one capability we lost, but we got another capability in the high explosives, in that we then had proximity rounds, so essentially variable time fuse, which we didn't have up until that point. So with the original, the AM50, we could do fire missions with high explosive to disrupt the enemy. We could use smoke for concealing movement or for obscuring observation, and we could use illumination to support nighttime operations. With the Swiss mortars, we couldn't do smoke because we didn't have smoke. But in those cases, the theory I understand was that the gun batteries of the regiments would support with 105 smoke, so they would be able to deploy smoke in support. But we couldn't do that organically with mortars. Now, interestingly enough, one of the unique features of the Swiss mortar, the Ruag 87, is it has an 81mm insert. So you can actually put a tube in the barrel and fire 81s from it. Now, we didn't, I don't know the exact number, we didn't have a full complement, so we have something like 90 mortars for the entire defense force, but we didn't have 90 inserts. But in theory, you could fire 81 smoke from a 120 mortar with the insert, but it's not something we practice.
So would there be a difference between attacking an enemy position with the intent to destroying it and suppressing an enemy position? So for both you would use HE, of course, but what would be the difference?
Well, it depends. Okay, so for example, normally when you get a firing order, you'll get the ammunition type, the charge, elevations, bearing, and you get a target description. So troops in the open, moving white rocks, I'll explain that to you later, forming up point, whatever the case may be. So with the French mortars, with the earlier mortar, we had a fuse setting called super quick and a fuse setting called delay. So super quick was impact, hits the ground, explodes. Fair enough. So you have guys moving in the open, you drop super quick on them, it just gives you fragmentation, kills lots of people, or disrupts what they're doing. But if you're firing that at people dug in, it doesn't do that much. So that's where the delay comes in. So you hit the ground, the round buries. And if I remember, and this is going off 20-year-old memory, I think it was like half a second delay. It was something very, very short. But within that time, it was enough time to bury the round in the ground, so that when it exploded, it would collapse field fortifications, damage buildings, do more damage than just spreading its explosive into the air. With Swiss mortars, with the later rounds, the M87, I think the bomb was MB88, we had variable time fuse or we had impact. So again, impact is like super quick, hits the ground, explodes, but variable time or proximity, as we called it, yourself, the round has a tiny radar and it detects terrain or it detects an obstacle at a certain distance. And if I remember, it's 3 meters, so it explodes off the ground, so that instead of imparting fire or imparting force into the ground, it disperses it in the air and causes shrapnel and blast damage to things around. So depending on what you're doing, if you're firing at a fixed position that's dug in, that's protected, you want either impact or delay. And if we're firing at troops in the open, proximity or impact would be better. So it depends on the mission. But again, that would be detailed in a fire order and generally with a target description, so you know what you're shooting at, so you know that what you're trying to do.
So an illumination would be basically supporting nighttime attack or illuminating an enemy position for recon or something along those lines.
Yeah, it could be both. Or, like, to give you an example, one of the few times we fired artillery outside of the state was in Lebanon for a search and rescue mission in, I'm going to say, and I wasn't there, I didn't serve overseas, I was in 1999, and they used 120 millimeter illum from the French mortars to illuminate a crash site. So there was a helicopter with Irish soldiers, I think it was an Italian helicopter, had gone down in South Lebanon at nighttime, and South Lebanon's pretty hilly, so you don't want guys walking around the hills at nighttime. You can avoid it, so they illuminated the crash zone. But yeah, we would use illum for supporting nighttime operations. That could be an attack, could be defense. It could be also to support an OP, because sometimes they might not actually see stuff. So if they want to see something, you start putting up illum. You light up an area, they can see the target, so you know if they're hitting it or if they need to hit it, or if guys are trying to attack what they're trying to do. And also, if you're in a defensive position, if you want to see if somebody's coming at you, you put up a flare, or you put up an illum round, and you can see what's going on.
So, what other aspects about mortar tactics you can tell us?
Well, it depends. Like, one of the interesting things that we were always taught was that mortars, in a sense, they're an area weapon, or the way we use them was as an area weapon. So what that means is you're not destroying a pinpoint target, because most mortars, I think the French, I'm not sure what else, the French definitely have a mortar that's 120 millimeters and rifled, so it's pretty accurate. But most 120 mortars are smoothbore. So inside the barrel, it's just a pipe. It's just completely smooth. So probably not the most accurate thing in the world. But the way a mortar works, so it's high trajectory, the round comes down at steep angle. When you're firing at high angles, when your rounds are coming in, the blast is more, sorry, I'm fucking this up. Yeah, sorry, so the difference between, say, a cannon or gun and a firing on flat trajectory and a mortar firing on high trajectory is blast radius. So when a round goes up, comes down, the blast radius is more evenly distributed. So when you're firing with mortars, you can do more damage, but even if you're not as precise, because the blast effect is more likely to be evenly distributed. Whereas if you're firing artillery ammunition or you're firing at low trajectories, you have inertia, so that carries the blast forward. So if you slightly miss something, like let's say we drop a 105 on you at low angle, if we miss, the blast is going away from you rather than towards you. Whereas we drop a 120 or a mortar or any one, depending, and it lands close to you, then you're more likely to be injured or to be killed by the blast effect than if it misses slightly. And it's something we don't really talk about, or you don't really hear about in, I want to say, Sydney Street, as the kids say. You don't hear about outside, like in the real world.
Yeah, so I would add here, for instance, a Ukrainian veteran I interviewed recently. He noted that he considers mortars now pinpoint weapons or precise weapons, because if you add a drone and proper apps where you can determine, like, you enter the ammunition and the geographical and meteorological data and the mortar, you get very accurate, and they were able to take out at least one tank in their unit with several shots, because, yeah, as you know, tanks have weak top armor. So nowadays with drones, of course, you have to like proper correction and proper apps. You can turn apparently most. I mean, if it's a really inaccurate mortar and the round flinches off every time, it's not possible with a regular mortar. It should be able nowadays to use it as a pinpoint weapon.
Interesting. Yeah, we wouldn't have used mortars to do pinpoint fire or do precise fire because it's not the way we were trained. And actually, funny you mentioned meteorological states. It's something we didn't have. Our like regular army units would generally have a meteorological section within their regiment, so that when they are doing shoots, they can put up balloons and they can put stuff pinpoint. But it's not something we trained to do, so it probably hindered our accuracy. But I don't know if I would consider a mortar to be precise. But yeah, you hit a tank on the lid with a 120, like the tank's not going anywhere, right? But yeah, whether I would consider it to be precision, well, that's just personal experience or personal. Yeah.
I mean, if you have like the perfect view, how you see that the round drops and everything and the information. I mean, it must be consistent. It must be consistent, of course. Like if the I'm not sure how to determine if a gun is consistent in the firing. So if you have like I know for artillery barrels, if they are really worn out, yeah, I mean it's not gonna happen. But if it's not worn out, yeah, should be.
Yeah, and the thing is, it may depend on the individual mortar. So to give you kind of an example from my experience, if you look at a Brandt AM50, so the French mortar, right? One of the, let's say, the less ergonomic aspects of it was that it could be deployed on its bipod with the carriage, so essentially the wheels, the trolley that it comes on, fixed, and that thing weighs something like 150 kilos. But what that meant is that when you fired the mortar, the bipods didn't move, right? With the Swiss mortar, the ROAG M87, the carriage doesn't connect to the bipods, and the bipods weigh maybe 30 kilos. I can't remember the exact number, but they're pretty light. They're pretty light. So when you fire that, what do? They flare. So what does that mean? When you fire a round, you have to reset the bipod, you have to reset the sights, and it's time consuming. So in theory, we could fire, I think the manual says sustained 6 rounds a minute. And I know from my experience, we struggle to do that because the bipods would flare. On the older mortar with the carriage attached to, and I'll try and get you a picture of this, with the carriage attached to the bipods, the barrel would stay where it was. And again, maybe if you're doing something like that, it could be accurate. You could get it down to a fine art. If you've a good OP team, if you've a good met state, if you know, because that's another thing, you need to know muzzle velocity, right? So like there's a lot of technical stuff goes into mortars, or goes into artillery in general that people don't think about. Like you need to know the weather state, you need to know the muzzle velocity of the individual gun, you need to know precise target distance and range, or sorry, range to target.
The heat of the barrel and everything.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, like you know, it's a reason that the original artillerymen were engineers, right? So like there's a lot of tech that goes into this.
A lot of math in there, yeah.
Yeah. Now to be fair, I don't understand a lot of it, but like, you know, you do the drill exists for a reason. You follow the drill, the thing will work. And you may get it down to a case where you can use a 120 mortar to stonk tanks. I don't want to ever be in a position where I have to try that. That's my perspective on the matter.
I think most people don't want.
Yeah, like if you're doing anti-tank with a 120, like something's gone wrong. But if your friend's knocking out tanks with it, then you know he's got my respect and my admiration, and you know, as they say in the Kriegsmarine, happy hunting, right? I hope he continues and gets as many tanks as he can. But yeah, I wouldn't be in a hurry to use a 120 as a precision weapon, just on my experience.
Anything to add about tactics or fire missions here?
Yeah, well, let's talk about two things, right? So we'll talk about deployments, because there's two separate types of general deployments. So normally you have prepared deployments, so you'll go to a position that's been surveyed, or you have quick actions, right? And those are the two types that we practice. Now, more often than not, we practice deliberate deployment. So we would go into a position where a regimental survey team has already been, they've laid out markers, so everything's kind of set up and ready to go. You would set up, and that's kind of more static. It's like if you're not going anywhere, if you're going to be occupying a period, or occupying a location for a long period of time, you do that. And what's interesting, but again, this is something you don't see because it's probably kind of boring, and you don't see represented in media, you don't see in the real world, is that when an artillery position is occupied by the fire unit, before they get there, there's been a bunch of surveyors out there with theodolites or with laser rangefinders working out exactly where each gun's going to go to the centimeter. So normally, like when we would occupy a gun position, what would happen is the GPO, the gun positioning officer, and his team would go out with location. They would scout the location. They would lay out little flags, so little metal flag, and each one would have a color. You would drive into the field, or you drive into what we call the battery hide, which is a location close to the firing position. You would meet the battery sergeant, and you would meet what we used to call the gun bunny, which was basically a runner, normally like the number 2 or one of the lesser important members of the crew. They would go out, they would be told what color you're going to occupy and what the order was. They would come back and tell you, and then you would drive in. And normally, probably doesn't work anymore because of drones, but we follow a track plan. So I don't know if you know what a track plan is, right? So to ensure or to reduce our visual signature from the sky, you would try to follow the vehicle in front of you. So if one car went through the field, you would drive on his track and everybody would follow that. Ammunition, limbers, everybody. And the idea being that somebody who's got surveillance up will see maybe one set of tracks if you're looking. And you would try to do things like the School of Artillery in Ireland were pretty good at this, working out track plans where they would go into a firing position and you would drive at the edge of forest cover, so like the shadow would cover the track. So like it would be hard to see how many vehicles were in the field, and then you'd be able to hide the vehicles under the trees. But you'd follow the track plan, you go to your location, and then what would happen is you would put your mortar into action. So you'd set it up, and I don't know if you've seen a mortar scale. There's normally 2 sets of numbers on each side. So you've a firing scale and you have a survey scale. The survey scale points you in what's called the center of arc, which is basically down the middle of the line that you're going to shoot down. And then the shooting scale allows you to pick either an aiming post, which is the metal rod that we would normally put out 50 meters in front of the mortar. And when we're set onto the center of arc, when the surveyor works out where we need to be, as long as we're pointing at as long as our sight, is pointing at the aiming post. So the aiming post could be somewhere on my left, my sight could be looking over there, and my barrel could be pointing over there. But as long as I've got those aligned properly, then my rounds are going to go, in theory, where the CPO wants me to go. And that's also something that people don't really see. They think when you go do artillery, you just point and shoot. Normally, 80% of the time, we didn't see where we were shooting at. We were firing from behind cover, behind terrain, because we don't need to see it. And that's one of the reasons survey is important, because they will actually go out. And in Ireland, what we would do in the Glen of Amal, there's, if I remember this, was 13 trigonometry points. So map locations that the Ordnance Survey had worked out way back in like 1830. They still exist. And we would know where they were to the millimeter. You'd send out a theodolite. You'd take a triangular measurement from that to another one. And then you'd be able to work out from those triangles where a gun position was and where each gun in that position, or in this case, each mortar in that position was. And like that's pretty time consuming, but something you don't see. People just assume you just go into the field and shoot. You don't. The survey party go out, they lay out a gun position using, again, some complex mathematics. And then when you occupy that position, in theory, you're ready to go. You're pointing in a straight line and all of the weapons are parallel. Because the thing is, if you have a dispersion of 100 meters, 200 meters between guns, then obviously there's going to be a difference, right? So you need to make sure that they're all pointing in the same place and that they're all adjusted accordingly. So that's something I always thought was really interesting that we never talk about, or you never see in films. Like the gun position is just always there, and you're like, how did it get there? Like somebody has to go out and actually do that. And so that was the kind of shooting we would most often practice. But there was one year, I think it was 2006, we did what was called a dispersed regimental shoot, which is probably more realistic, where we had one position, we had one mortar, and then like half a kilometer away we had another, and like to survey that is really difficult. And that's probably the kind of thing you would do today, because you can't have just 6 mortars in a field or 6 105s in a field, because Bobby with his drone is going to come on, ruin your day, right? So yeah, that was the kind of thing I thought it was pretty interesting. So my dog is with the beard. We're pretty interested that we don't see represented anywhere and that people don't talk about. They just think, oh, the cannon goes in the field and the cannon shoots. Now, maybe when you're in the US or if you're a British soldier and you're using something like line-apps, which is an inertial navigation system or inertial pointing system, which will tell you where you are. You don't have to do something as old school and as technical as surveying. But the thing is, line-apps can be interrupted, right? Or, and GPS systems can be disrupted. You can't disrupt somebody with a telescope unless you're shooting at them. So I think it's something like it's a skill that we still maintain, which back when I was serving, I thought was stupid. I was like, why are we doing this? Why don't we have inertial pointing systems? Why don't we have GPS pointing systems? And now I'm kind of like, you know what? Actually, this makes sense in constrained EW environments and constrained GPS environments. It makes sense to be able to actually go and do it the old-fashioned, annoying way. And I was talking to a Finnish officer recently, and apparently in their school of artillery, when they teach new officers and when they teach new gun commanders, they teach them the manual way, and then they learn the high-tech way when they go to their regiments, so that they still have the basic skills. So in the event that the GPS or the inertial navigation system's not working, they can still do work by map and compass, which I think is pretty awesome.
A short question. So you're very dependent on the survey team. So is the survey
Oh,
team
absolutely.
basically, if somebody takes out the survey team, you have a hard problem getting anything to work, or is it?
Yeah,
or is there
no,
some way?
you lose a lot of accuracy. That's the big problem. And the thing is, if you're firing in support of an infantry battalion or friendly units, you want to be as accurate and as precise properly. You don't, blue on blue is not a happy accident, right? So you lose the survey team, then you lose accuracy. And that brings me to my next type of shootings, which was called the quick action. And normally a quick action is something that's done en route or done unplanned. So let's say the battery is moving from point A to point B, and on the way something happens, and you have to engage an enemy quickly. A quick action is normally done in the place where you are in that moment. So, for example, with 25 pounders, I don't know if I told you that we had 25 pounders in one of our batteries, and we also had 105s. You would fire those in the middle of the road. So you would literally just stop, unlimber them. You wouldn't even put out the firing platform. What you would do is the number one, so the detachment commander, the ammunition numbers, and the driver would sit on the trail. So basically the back of the gun to weigh it down, so that when they fired, that hopefully the spade would catch into the ground and that it would hold it in position. And you would just fire, and the CPO would take out his prismatic compass, because normally you would do this visually. The CPO would take out a prismatic compass and just start manually shooting out the error. So basically he would say, I don't know, charge 1, elevation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, bearing blah 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 blah. And you would just get going, and he would just be like, right, up, and he would do it manually. The problem with that is you're thundering away ammunition. It's not super accurate. But the thing is, you would do that in an emergency situation or in an unplanned situation. With mortars, it's a little bit more complex, because it's very difficult to fire visually over something that's plunging, right? You can't just look, you can't just point and shoot and know where it's going. And B, mortars have a base plate. So you've seen the bottom of a mortar, you've like this big metal tin, or a big metal circle, or a big metal triangle in the case of a French mortar. And on the mortars that I trained on, both of those weighed around 90 kilos. So they're pretty heavy. And they're supporting the weight of an entire round and the barrel and the bipod assembly. And when you fire, they start sinking into the ground. And I don't have it anymore, but I had a photograph of me on one of my last shoots where I curled up in a ball like the Terminator and got into my base plate hole, and my whole body fit in it. So, like, if you fire that on a road, if you fire on a metal road, you're going to have a bad day because it's going to slide, it's going to hurt somebody. If you fire it on a non-metal road, you're going to destroy the road. So normally what you would do in those situations is go to the nearest place that you can actually deploy. So either off the road or in a field or wherever is convenient. And then that would be a little bit more difficult to shoot out because you can't fire direct, so you have to kind of figure it out. And normally the CPO will have a range table, which will tell him at a certain angle, at a certain elevation, at a certain charge, a round will go a certain distance. So if he knows the enemy is, I don't know, a kilometer away, that he knows charge 1 at, I don't know, I'm going to do degrees for a second, 80 degrees, you should be in theory in the ballpark at that distance, and then you just left and right out the traverse, and hopefully you get on target. And then once you're on target, you just start firing for effect. And that's something we would do occasionally. We wouldn't do it too often because A, ammunition for us is quite scarce, and B, it's quite difficult and somewhat dangerous. I don't know if you know, but the Glen of Amal is quite small. It's the only artillery range in Ireland, and the entire area, the entire training area, not just the impact area, is 24 square kilometers. And to put that into context that maybe you'll understand, Allenstag, that's somehow I pronounce that, the training area in Austria.
Allensteig.
Okay, yeah. Is 165 square kilometers.
Okay, yeah.
So just to give you an idea how small this is, so we can't really always just go and like, let's just hope this goes somewhere, right? Because
yeah.
the other problem we have is the Glen of Amal is beside one of the tallest mountains in the east of Ireland. So it's a very popular picnicking spot. And there are civilian walking lanes either side of the impact area. And there have been cases, not where people have been hit by rounds, but where people have found rounds that have either gone slightly out of bounds or gone close to the edge of the bounds. And there was a recent story, I'm talking the last month or so, where a walking party found an 84 millimeter anti-tank round that had not detonated. And this is a very weird situation. One of the group, a bunch of civilians just walking on the edge of this range because it's a public road on the edge of the range. One of the guys in the group took a photograph, took a GPS location, emailed it to the Department of Defense. Another member of the group took the round home with them. It's just like in one group they had super clever and a moron, because it's like to have the wherewithal to go, okay, here's a picture of the thing in the ground, here's the location in the ground, there you go. So a couple of days later or a day later, I don't know what the time frame was, the bomb squad go up to have a look at this thing and it's not there. So there's a national alert put out: if you've taken something from the Glen of Amal, please don't touch it, please call the cops. And they found it like 2 or 3 days later. It was pretty quick, to be fair, but like, you know, it's one of those things. You've got a range area that's tiny, that's surrounded by civilians, so we can't really go and do quick actions because maybe there's a danger that you end up putting rounds outside bounds, which, you know, even can happen when you're doing survey shoot. Like if you fire on a wrong charge, like I haven't seen it, but I've heard guys firing 105 on charge 2 or 25 pounder on charge 2 and not seeing where the round went. You know, happily nobody got hurt, so like we assume it went somewhere in the range area, but like we don't know. So, you know, again, when you're firing quick actions, you maybe don't want to be doing that too often in an area where people tend to go walking.
Yeah, I mean, you can miss a lot even with direct fire, with indirect fire. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dermot.
You're welcome.
Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.